A man in a faded gray jacket walked into a private hangar minutes before a jet worth tens of millions of dollars was set to take off. Within seconds, a security guard grabbed his arm and barked at him to leave, telling him this was not a place for someone like him. Wealthy travelers standing nearby laughed under their breath, glancing at the old pickup truck parked outside the gate. The man did not argue. He did not raise his voice or reach for his phone to prove anything. He simply stood there, calm, watching the aircraft being prepared for departure, as if none of the mockery around him mattered at all. Then the captain came down the stairs, looked at him for a long moment, and whispered words that made the entire hangar go silent. "Everyone," he said, "that man owns this airport." The private airfield sat on the edge of the city, hidden behind rows of manicured hedges and a gate that only certain vehicles were allowed to pass. Inside, the hangar gleamed under white industrial lighting, its floor polished to a mirror shine that reflected the silhouettes of private jets lined up like sleeping giants. Business owners in tailored suits moved through the space with quiet confidence, trailed by assistants carrying leather folders and cups of coffee no one had asked them to fetch. A row of Rolls-Royce sedans waited outside, engines idling, drivers standing at attention with white gloves and rehearsed smiles. Service staff, in crisp uniforms, glided between the guests, refilling glasses and adjusting jacket collars, careful never to let a single request go unanswered. It was a world built entirely on appearances, where wealth spoke before words ever needed to. Into that world drove Marcus Elijah Brooks behind the wheel of a Ford pickup truck that had clearly seen better decades. The paint was chipped along the door panels, and the engine rattled slightly as it rolled to a stop near the hangar entrance, drawing more than a few sideways glances. Marcus stepped out wearing plain khaki trousers and a simple jacket, the kind of clothing a man might wear to run errands on an ordinary afternoon. He had no bodyguards trailing behind him, no assistant carrying his schedule, no entourage announcing his arrival the way every other visitor that morning had been announced. In one hand, he carried an old leather briefcase, its edges worn soft from years of use, the kind of object that told a story no one in that hangar cared to read. He walked toward the entrance with an unhurried, steady pace, as though he had walked this exact path 1,000 times before. The guard stationed at the door noticed him almost immediately, his eyes narrowing the moment Marcus came into view. Todd Miller, the head of hangar security, had built his entire career on reading people at a glance, or at least that was what he told himself every morning before his shift began. He looked Marcus up and down, taking in the scuffed shoes and the plain jacket, and something in his expression shifted into open suspicion. Todd stepped forward with his chest puffed out, blocking the entrance with his body before Marcus had even reached the doorway. He asked for identification, his tone already carrying the edge of a man who had decided the answer before the question was finished. Marcus reached calmly into his jacket and explained that he only needed a few minutes inside the hangar, nothing more. Todd let out a short, mocking laugh, the kind meant to be heard by everyone standing nearby. He asked where Marcus thought he was, reminding him loudly that this was a private facility reserved for verified clients and their guests. A few travelers turned their heads at the commotion, murmuring to one another as they took in the scene unfolding by the entrance. None of them could imagine a reasonable explanation for why a man dressed the way Marcus was dressed would have any business in that hangar. Whispers spread quickly through the small crowd, each person offering their own theory about who he might be and why he was there. Not a single person guessed the truth, because the truth was far too large for anyone in that moment to consider. One businessman standing near the coffee cart leaned toward his colleague and joked that perhaps the man had confused the airport with a delivery drop-off point somewhere down the road. His companion laughed quietly, careful not to be too loud, though the sound still carried across the polished floor and reached Marcus without any difficulty at all. Nearby, a woman in a cream-colored coat pulled her own jacket a little tighter, as though the mere presence of Marcus required some kind of physical distance to feel comfortable again. None of them stopped to consider that the calm on his face might mean something other than confusion or embarrassment. They saw only what they expected to see, a man who did not fit the picture they had already painted of who belonged in that space and who did not. It was a judgment formed in less than a second, yet it would take far longer than a second for its consequences to fully unfold. Todd turned to the two guards standing near the gate and gave a sharp nod, instructing them to block the entrance completely. Marcus did not move, did not protest, did not reach for a phone or demand to speak with a manager the way most people might have in his position. He simply stood there, his eyes drifting past the guards toward the aircraft being fueled and checked in the distance. There was something unreadable in his expression, not anger, not humiliation, but a quiet patience that seemed almost out of place given the circumstances. The onlookers mistook that patience for defeat, assuming the man had finally understood he did not belong and would soon walk away. They could not have been more wrong about what was actually happening in that moment. Todd stepped closer, clearly enjoying the attention his authority was drawing from the small crowd gathering nearby. He told Marcus flatly that he needed to leave the premises immediately, his voice rising just enough to make sure everyone within earshot could hear him. Marcus responded quietly, explaining once more that he had an appointment inside the hangar and simply needed a few minutes of time. Todd waved a dismissive hand, cutting him off before he could finish the sentence, insisting that no appointments existed under that name in the system. It was at that moment that Richard Hale, the airport's chief executive, emerged from a nearby office, drawn by the small crowd that had formed near the entrance. Richard had a reputation for enjoying moments like this, moments where he could remind everyone present exactly who held the power in that building. Richard walked toward the group with his shoulders squared, his expensive shoes clicking against the polished floor with deliberate confidence. He looked at Marcus the way a man might look at an unwanted stain on an otherwise spotless carpet, his lips curling into a thin, condescending smile. Richard announced loudly that this facility existed to serve genuine clients, people who belonged in a space built for wealth and importance. Marcus remained still, his expression unchanged, betraying nothing of what he might have been thinking as the words landed around him. He did not argue, did not raise his voice, did not attempt to defend himself against the assumptions being hurled his way. Richard, mistaking that silence for weakness, ordered the guards to escort him out of the building immediately. Several onlookers pulled out their phones, recording the scene as though it were entertainment rather than a moment of quiet cruelty. Laughter rippled through pockets of the crowd, some guests exchanging amused glances while others shook their heads in disapproval that never quite turned into intervention. One woman near the coffee station murmured to her companion that the man had probably wandered into the wrong building entirely. Marcus, still unmoved by the commotion around him, turned his gaze toward the jet standing on the tarmac beyond the glass doors. He asked, in a calm and steady voice, whether the aircraft was ready for departure, a question that seemed to catch everyone off guard. Todd burst into laughter, asking sarcastically why a man like him would care about the readiness of a private jet at all. Richard folded his arms and studied Marcus for a long moment, as though trying to decide whether the man in front of him was simply confused or deliberately testing his patience. He reminded the small crowd, in a voice pitched for maximum effect, that the hangar existed for people who had earned their place through decades of hard-won success. Nobody in that crowd thought to ask what success actually looked like, or whether it could ever be judged accurately from the outside within the span of a few seconds. A young intern standing near the coffee station whispered to a colleague that this was exactly the kind of story people liked to tell later at dinner parties. Marcus heard the comment clearly, though nothing in his posture indicated that the words had landed anywhere close to where they were intended to sting. He simply exhaled once, slow and unhurried, the way a man exhales when he has already lived through far harder mornings than this one. The guards closed in around Marcus, their hands firm on his arms, as they began guiding him toward the exit doors. He did not resist, did not struggle, did not raise his voice in protest even as the crowd watched him being pushed out of a building he had every right to enter. The doors swung shut behind him with a heavy, final sound, leaving Marcus standing alone on the pavement outside, the morning sun casting long shadows across the tarmac. Inside, Todd dusted off his hands as if he had just completed an important task, basking in the quiet approval of the onlookers who had gathered to watch. Richard returned to his office with a satisfied smirk, already forgetting the incident as though it were nothing more than routine business. None of them noticed the pilot who had just finished his pre-flight inspection, walking briskly toward the hangar entrance with a look of dawning recognition on his face. Captain Daniel Foster had spent the better part of the morning running through his checklist, moving methodically around the aircraft with the practiced calm of a man who had flown for more than 2 decades. As he stepped back into the hangar to retrieve a final document, his eyes swept across the room and landed on the scene just outside the glass doors. He froze mid-step, his breath catching as he recognized the figure being escorted away by security. Daniel's heart began to pound as he pushed forward through the crowd, moving with an urgency that startled the people around him. Todd, still riding the high of his earlier display, stepped into Daniel's path and asked him what the problem was. Daniel's voice came out sharp and tight as he asked why Mr. Brooks was standing outside the building instead of being welcomed in. Todd blinked, confused by the sudden shift in tone, and explained that they had simply removed an unauthorized visitor from the premises. The color drained from Daniel's face almost instantly, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dread as the weight of what had just happened settled over him. He turned toward Richard, who had reappeared at the sound of raised voices, still wearing that same smug, self-satisfied expression. Daniel's jaw tightened as he stared at his employer, his mind racing through the implications of what security had just done to a man they knew nothing about. He said only a few words, his voice low and controlled, telling them that they had just made a terrible mistake. Neither Todd nor Richard understood the gravity behind those words, and Todd even let out another short laugh, waving off the warning as though it were an overreaction. Without another word, Daniel pushed past them and walked quickly toward the doors, his pace almost breaking into a run by the time he reached the exit. He stepped outside and found Marcus standing calmly near the edge of the tarmac, watching the aircraft with the same quiet patience he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. Daniel approached him slowly, his posture shifting into something resembling deep respect, the kind usually reserved for someone of enormous stature. He lowered his head slightly, a gesture that would have seemed strange to anyone who did not understand what was happening beneath the surface of that moment. The two men clasped hands, and the simple act of that handshake seemed to change the temperature of the entire hangar behind them. Guests who had been laughing moments earlier fell silent, sensing that something significant was unfolding right in front of them, even if they could not yet explain what it was. Daniel spoke quietly, his voice trembling slightly with the weight of sincere apology, telling Marcus how deeply sorry he was for what had just occurred. Marcus offered a small, understanding nod, his expression softening for the first time since he had arrived at the hangar that morning. There was history between the two men, a friendship built over many years, though very few people had ever known the true nature of who Marcus really was. Daniel had always kept that secret carefully, honoring a request Marcus had made long ago to never reveal his identity within the walls of the airport. It was a request born not out of vanity or secrecy for its own sake, but out of a deep desire to understand the business the way an ordinary person might experience it. Today, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, Marcus had come without warning, without an appointment, without any of the usual arrangements that normally preceded his visits. Years before that morning, Marcus Elijah Brooks had been nothing more than a young mechanic working long shifts in the maintenance bays of a regional airfield hundreds of miles away. He grew up in a modest household, the son of a bus driver and a seamstress, learning early on that nothing in life would be handed to him without effort. Aviation captured his imagination from the moment he first watched a small aircraft lift off the ground, and he poured every ounce of his energy into learning everything he could about engines and airframes. He worked his way up slowly, earning certifications, taking on extra shifts, saving every dollar he could, while his peers spent their money on things that offered no lasting return. When his wife passed away unexpectedly after only a few years of marriage, Marcus channeled his grief into an almost obsessive focus on his career and his modest but growing investments. He never remarried, choosing instead to raise no children of his own, pouring what remained of his heart into building something that might one day matter beyond himself. Marcus began purchasing small shares in aviation infrastructure companies, starting with amounts so modest that most financial advisors would have dismissed them entirely. He studied the industry from the inside out, understanding runway logistics and hangar operations in ways most executives never bothered to learn firsthand. Over time, those small investments compounded, each success funding the next opportunity, each opportunity teaching him something new about the business he had once only served as a laborer. 2 decades passed in what felt to him like the blink of an eye, filled with careful decisions, quiet risks, and a discipline that few people around him ever fully understood. By the time he turned 40, Marcus had become the controlling shareholder of the very airport that had once employed men, just like the young mechanic he used to be. Yet he made a deliberate choice to remain invisible, avoiding press coverage and public appearances, preferring instead to walk through his own properties as an anonymous observer. He believed that the truest measure of any business could only be found in how it treated the people who seemed to matter least, not the polished reports delivered in boardrooms filled with flattery. Only a handful of trusted board members and a few close associates like Daniel ever knew the full truth about who Marcus Elijah Brooks really was. He preferred it that way, believing that people who knew his status would only ever show him a performance, never the truth of who they really were underneath. That morning, for reasons even he could not fully articulate, Marcus had decided to visit the hangar without any prior notice, dressed exactly as he might dress on any ordinary day. He wanted to see the airport the way any unremarkable visitor might see it, stripped of titles, stripped of appointments, stripped of the deference that usually surrounded him. What he found instead was a lesson far more painful and far more necessary than anything a scheduled inspection could ever have revealed to him. There had been other visits over the years, each one conducted with the same quiet discipline, each one designed to strip away the layers of performance that wealth so often produced in the people around it. Marcus had walked through terminals in other cities, wearing similarly plain clothing, sitting for hours in waiting areas just to see how staff treated travelers who seemed unremarkable or unhurried. He had learned more from those quiet hours of observation than from any quarterly report handed to him by an eager executive hoping to impress him. Daniel had accompanied him on a few of those visits early in their friendship, watching Marcus take notes in the same worn notebook he still carried today, decades later. It was during one of those trips that Daniel first understood the full depth of what Marcus valued, a kind of integrity that could not be bought or performed under observation. That understanding was exactly why, years later, standing in that same hangar, Daniel had reacted with such urgency the moment he recognized his old friend being pushed toward the door. Back in the hangar, Todd was beginning to sense that something had shifted, though he could not yet understand exactly what. He watched from a distance as Daniel and Marcus spoke quietly near the tarmac, his earlier confidence starting to waver into something closer to uncertainty. He called out toward them, insisting once more that the man needed to leave the property before he caused any further disruption to the morning's schedule. Daniel turned toward him, his expression hardening into something Todd had never seen from the usually easygoing pilot. He walked back toward Richard, who had drifted closer to observe the strange scene unfolding near the doors. Slowly, deliberately, Daniel said the words that would change everything for everyone standing in that hangar that morning. He told Richard, in a voice loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear, that Mr. Brooks was the owner of the airport they were all standing inside. A heavy silence fell over the space, so complete that the distant hum of a fuel truck outside became suddenly, uncomfortably loud. People exchanged glances, certain they must have misheard something, certain that such a statement could not possibly apply to the man they had just watched being dragged out the door. Richard let out a nervous, disbelieving laugh, waving a hand as though swatting away an absurd joke that had gone too far. Todd, still clinging to his earlier certainty, declared flatly that what Daniel was saying was simply impossible, that a man dressed the way Marcus was dressed could never hold such a position. Daniel did not bother arguing further, choosing instead to pull out his phone and place a call that would settle the matter beyond any doubt. He reached Olivia Grant, the airport's executive vice president, whose office sat only a short walk from the hangar itself. Within minutes she appeared at the entrance, her heels clicking rapidly against the polished floor as she hurried toward the growing crowd near the tarmac doors. Olivia had worked closely with the ownership group for years, and unlike most of the staff, She had met Marcus on several occasions during private board discussions. The moment her eyes landed on him standing quietly near the aircraft, all the tension in her shoulders released into something resembling shock, followed almost instantly by alarm. She crossed the remaining distance quickly, her expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror as she pieced together what must have just occurred. Without hesitation, she lowered her head slightly, greeting him with a respect that left absolutely no room for doubt about who he truly was. Olivia addressed him formally, calling him Chairman Brooks in a voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear clearly. The words landed on the crowd like a physical blow, and an eerie, total silence swept through the hangar as the truth finally settled over everyone present. Richard's face went pale, his earlier confidence crumbling into something closer to panic as the reality of what he had just done became impossible to ignore. Todd stood frozen near the entrance, his mouth slightly open, the color draining from his cheeks as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Marcus, for his part, remained remarkably composed, showing no trace of anger or satisfaction at the sudden reversal unfolding around him. He simply turned to Olivia and asked, in a quiet, measured tone, whether he had truly just been denied entry to a property that belonged to him. No one offered an answer, because no answer could possibly soften the truth of what had happened only minutes earlier. Olivia, understanding the seriousness of the moment, requested that someone immediately pull up the ownership records on the nearest display screen. A large monitor near the operations desk flickered to life, revealing a detailed corporate structure chart that traced ownership back through several holding entities. At the very top of that chart, unmistakably, sat the name Marcus Elijah Brooks, listed as the controlling shareholder with an ownership stake that left absolutely no room for interpretation. Gasps rippled through the crowd of onlookers, many of whom had been laughing openly at Marcus only minutes before this revelation. Those same faces now turned downward, unable to meet his gaze, the weight of their earlier mockery suddenly impossible to ignore or excuse. The businessman who had joked about deliveries stood frozen near the coffee cart, his cup halfway to his lips, unable to finish the small, careless laugh he had begun only moments earlier. The woman in the cream-colored coat looked away entirely, suddenly finding great interest in the tips of her own shoes, rather than the man she had physically distanced herself from earlier that morning. Even the drivers waiting beside their idling sedans outside seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, exchanging confused glances through the glass doors of the hangar. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, someone lowered a phone that had been recording only moments earlier, apparently reconsidering what exactly they had planned to do with that footage. The silence in the hangar stretched on, broken only by the quiet hum of machinery and the distant sound of a jet engine being tested on the far side of the tarmac. It was the kind of silence that carried more weight than any amount of shouting ever could have. Richard stepped forward first, his voice cracking slightly as he began stammering out an apology, the words tumbling over one another in his rush to explain himself. He insisted it had all been a terrible misunderstanding, that security protocols had simply been followed a bit too rigidly given the circumstances. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression neither cold nor forgiving, simply attentive in a way that made Richard even more uncomfortable than outright anger would have. Todd, watching his own career flash before his eyes, moved closer as well, nearly bowing as he begged for a chance to explain his actions from earlier that morning. Marcus raised a single hand, gently but firmly, signaling that he had heard enough apologies for the moment and needed no further explanation of what had already happened. He told them plainly that he did not need an apology, that words offered under pressure meant far less than the actions that had come before them. Instead of retreating to an office or demanding immediate consequences, Marcus began walking slowly along the length of the hangar, taking in every detail of the space around him. He paused near each staff member he passed, looking them directly in the eye, asking a single, simple question that seemed to carry far more weight than its brevity suggested. He asked whether this was how they typically treated visitors who did not appear to match a certain image of wealth or importance. Many of the employees lowered their eyes, unable to answer honestly, their silence speaking volumes about a culture that had clearly existed long before that morning. Marcus began to understand, piece by piece, that what had happened to him was not an isolated mistake, but a pattern that had likely repeated itself countless times before. Complaints had been filed in the past, he learned, only to be quietly buried by Richard, who preferred a spotless record over honest accountability. Todd, it turned out, had a history of overstepping his authority, treating certain visitors with suspicion based on nothing more than appearance and assumption. Marcus said very little as these details emerged, choosing instead to listen carefully, noting names and incidents in a small notebook he kept in his worn leather briefcase. He did not raise his voice, did not issue immediate threats, did not allow his own hurt to dictate hasty decisions in front of an audience still recovering from shock. Instead, he moved through the hangar with the same quiet deliberateness he had shown from the very beginning of the morning's events. By the time he reached the far end of the building, he had heard enough to understand the true scope of what needed to change. He turned to Olivia and asked her to arrange an emergency meeting with the entire leadership team before the end of the day. One older employee, a ground coordinator who had worked at the airport for nearly 15 years, quietly approached Marcus as he made his way toward the far wall of the hangar. She told him, in a hushed voice, about a delivery driver who had once been refused entry in almost the exact same manner months earlier, simply because his uniform looked worn and his hands were stained with grease. She explained that she had reported the incident to Richard at the time, only to be told that the matter was not worth pursuing further. Marcus thanked her for her honesty, writing her account carefully into his notebook alongside the others he had already collected that afternoon. He understood in that moment that the morning's events were not an isolated failure, but a symptom of something that had been allowed to fester for a very long time. It strengthened his resolve, though it did nothing to change the calm, measured way he intended to address it. The meeting convened later that afternoon in a wide conference room overlooking the runway, every senior executive and department head seated around a long, polished table. For the first time in the company's history, Marcus took the chair at the head of that table, a seat he had always deliberately avoided during his rare and quiet visits. He recounted the morning's events calmly, without exaggeration or theatrical emphasis, simply describing exactly what had happened from the moment he stepped out of his truck. His voice never rose above a measured, even tone, yet the weight of his words seemed to press down on everyone seated around him. When he finished, he asked a single question that hung in the air far longer than its short length would suggest. He asked what would have happened to him that morning if he had truly been nothing more than an ordinary man with no title and no fortune behind his name. No one in the room offered an answer, because everyone already understood exactly what that answer would have been. Marcus allowed the silence to settle before continuing, his voice steady as he outlined the decisions he had already made regarding the incident. Richard Hale, he announced, would be removed from his position as chief executive effective immediately, a consequence of both his actions that morning and the pattern of neglect that had allowed similar incidents to persist. Todd Miller's employment would be terminated as well, his conduct representing exactly the kind of behavior the company could no longer afford to tolerate. Beyond those immediate personnel decisions, Marcus announced the creation of an entirely new customer service framework, one built around dignity and fairness, rather than assumptions based on appearance. Every employee, from senior executives to ground staff, would undergo mandatory training designed to confront and dismantle the kind of unconscious bias that had led to that morning's events. He explained that from that point forward, staff would be trained to evaluate visitors based on their behavior and their needs, never on the clothes they wore or the vehicles they arrived in. A quiet murmur of agreement spread through the room, followed by something unexpected, given the gravity of the morning's events. One by one, the staff and executives seated around the table rose to their feet, applauding not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect for the man who had chosen restraint over retribution. Marcus accepted the applause with a small, humble nod, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, even as the room continued to show its appreciation. He reminded them gently that the goal was never punishment for its own sake, but the creation of a place where no one else would ever have to endure what he had experienced that morning. The meeting ended not with fear or resentment, but with a shared sense that something meaningful had shifted within the walls of that company. In the days that followed, Marcus made a point of walking through every corner of the airport, something he had rarely done so openly before that week. He spoke with the cleaning staff who arrived before sunrise to polish the same floors travelers walked across without ever noticing the effort behind their shine. He sat with the mechanics in the maintenance bay, asking detailed questions about the aircraft they serviced, clearly still fluent in the language of engines and hydraulics from his own years in that exact role. He spent time with the ground crew coordinating luggage and fuel logistics, and with the technicians responsible for keeping every system running smoothly behind the scenes. In each conversation, something of his own younger self seemed to surface, a memory of standing exactly where they now stood, wearing the same kind of uniform, carrying the same quiet pride in work that often went unnoticed. He remembered what it felt like to be overlooked, and he was determined to ensure that feeling would no longer define the experience of anyone working under his ownership. Before the week concluded, Marcus announced a series of new initiatives designed to invest directly in the people who kept the airport running every single day. He established an apprenticeship fund aimed at training young people from underserved communities for careers in aviation maintenance and operations. He created a hardship assistance program for employees facing unexpected financial difficulties, remembering all too well the years when a single crisis could have derailed his own path entirely. A new pilot training scholarship was launched as well, offering promising candidates from modest backgrounds the chance to pursue careers in the cockpit rather than merely dreaming of them from the ground. He also committed significant funding toward expanding and modernizing the maintenance facilities, ensuring the mechanics who had once been exactly like him would have access to better tools and safer working conditions. Daniel, watching these announcements unfold over the following days, found himself deeply moved by how consistent Marcus remained with the values he had always privately expressed during their years of quiet friendship. Olivia, too, sensed that something fundamental had shifted within the organization, a change that went far beyond new policies printed on paper. She began noticing subtle differences in how staff interacted with visitors, a new attentiveness that seemed to stem from genuine understanding rather than fear of punishment. A new customer greeting protocol was quietly introduced, one that asked staff to offer the same warm welcome to every visitor, regardless of how they arrived or what they wore walking through the door. Employees, who had once been quick to judge, found themselves pausing before forming conclusions, remembering the story that had spread through every department within days of that difficult morning. Even the valet staff outside began treating every vehicle with equal courtesy, whether it was a gleaming imported sedan or a truck with rust creeping along its wheel wells. It was a small shift, almost invisible to an outsider, yet it represented exactly the kind of change Marcus had hoped his ownership could eventually produce. Before returning to his truck at the end of that long week, Marcus paused near the entrance of the very hangar where he had been turned away only days before. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the space with an expression that carried no bitterness, only quiet reflection on everything that had unfolded since that morning. The hangar looked the same as it always had, polished floors and gleaming aircraft, yet something about the atmosphere inside it felt undeniably different now. He turned and walked toward his old pickup truck, climbing into the driver's seat exactly as he had done countless times before, unnoticed and unbothered by the world around him. 6 months passed, and the transformation within the airport had become impossible to ignore for anyone who had known it before that pivotal week. Customer satisfaction scores climbed steadily, month after month, as staff embraced a culture built around respect rather than assumption. Employees spoke with newfound pride about where they worked, no longer viewing their roles as simply serving the wealthy, but as contributing to something genuinely well-run and fair. New hires joining the operations team often heard the story of what had happened that morning, retold now not as gossip, but as a kind of quiet legend passed between colleagues. One young employee, only weeks into her new position, approached Daniel one afternoon near the same hangar where it had all begun. She asked him, with a note of disbelief in her voice, whether it was really true that the owner of the entire airport had once been thrown out of his own hangar. Daniel smiled, the memory clearly still vivid in his mind, even after all the months that had passed since that morning. He told her simply that yes, it was true, every detail of it exactly as the story had been told. She asked why a man with such power would allow himself to be treated that way without immediately revealing who he was. Daniel explained that Marcus had not come that day to inspect the aircraft or review the accounts, though those had certainly been reasons enough for a man in his position to visit. He had come, Daniel said, to examine something far more important than machinery or financial statements, something that could never be measured on a balance sheet. He had come to see the true character of the people entrusted with running his company, and what he found that day changed everything that followed. Marcus continued to visit the airport in exactly the same way he always had, arriving in his weathered pickup truck, dressed in the same plain, unassuming clothing he had always favored. No one who worked there any longer judged him by his appearance, understanding now that the true measure of a person had nothing to do with the vehicle they drove or the label on their jacket. Every staff member who crossed his path greeted him with a warmth that came not from fear or obligation, but from a respect they had earned the right to feel toward him. Through everything that followed his difficult morning, word of what had happened at the airport eventually spread beyond its walls, quietly inspiring conversations in other companies about the assumptions embedded in how people treated one another. Marcus never sought that attention, never gave interviews about the incident, never allowed the story to become a tool for building his own reputation. He remained, as he always had been, a man who preferred quiet action over public recognition, letting the changes speak for themselves rather than his own words. Todd, for his part, was never heard from again within the aviation industry, his name quietly circulating among a few former colleagues as a cautionary example rather than anything resembling sympathy. Richard resurfaced briefly at a smaller regional airport months later, though those who had worked under him at the hangar noted a subtle change in his demeanor, a caution that had not existed before that morning. Whether that change reflected genuine growth or simple fear of repeating the same mistake, no one could say for certain, and Marcus himself never spoke of either man again. He had never been interested in ruining lives, only in ensuring that the pattern behind those lives could no longer continue unchecked within something he was responsible for. That distinction mattered to him deeply, even if very few people ever heard him explain it in exactly those terms. It was simply how he had always chosen to lead, long before anyone in that hangar knew his name at all. On a clear evening many months later, Marcus stood alone near the edge of the runway as the sun began sinking low behind the distant hills. A private jet lifted off in the distance, its engines roaring softly as it climbed into the darkening sky, carrying passengers toward destinations he would likely never know. He watched it rise, until it became a small, fading point against the orange horizon, his expression calm and unreadable in the fading light. A gentle smile crossed his face, not one of pride or vindication, but something quieter and more enduring than either of those feelings could ever be. Status, he had learned long before that morning in the hangar, could make people bow their heads out of obligation or fear, a hollow kind of deference that meant nothing once the power behind it disappeared. But character, true character, was the only thing capable of earning the kind of respect that remained even after the title was forgotten, even after the wealth no longer mattered, even after everything else had faded into the quiet dusk of an ordinary evening.